All right. Hello and welcome into this most recent edition of the Autzen Audibles podcast. I'm your host, Jared Mack. With me, as always, friend, colleague, Erik Skopil. Erik, how we doing today?
I've got a road trip coming up. I'm actually going
Yeah, you do.
someplace. This is
Yeah.
I've waited all the way until nearly the end of the regular season to get on a plane again, but I'm fired up. I've heard great things about Madison. The weather report suggests it's better there than here. So sign me up. I can't wait. Should be really fun.
Yeah, I'm jealous. I think Madison is definitely one of the higher places to go to in the Big Ten. And the weather thing, I'm glad you brought that up. I was going to bring it up later, but I might as well bring it up now. I just thought it was, I thought it was a silly kind of idea that it's going to be like terrible weather in November in Wisconsin. Like, yeah, it's probably not going to be great, but would it be much better here? Like,
This is
just saying,
th- th-
this is not a great time here either.
This is the West Coast ignorance to what happens in the Midwest, because I was one of those people being like, maybe we'll have a weather game. And then as we've gotten
No,
much closer, it's like, nah, it's not really a thing that's going to be a factor this weekend. So,
no,
which
it
is,
doesn't
by the way,
really.
I think pretty good, which is a big deal, I think, to me. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
100%. No, I was just gonna say it doesn't like. No, I've never lived in Wisconsin, but I know from living in Massachusetts, like the snow doesn't really arrive until like December, January, where like that's a real thing. And there's certainly been games in years past, and for some
Sure.
reason in recent years it's been warmer all of a sudden, but that's a different topic for another day. I just didn't expect it was going to be that bad. I think it actually is going to be like the same exact temperature as it would be here up in Wisconsin. So I don't think that that's going to be as big of a factor as some people thought going into the season. But um, all that Wisconsin talk to let you know that Oregon is playing Wisconsin this weekend, Saturday, November 16th, starting at 4:30 Pacific, 7:30 Eastern on NBC, streaming on Peacock. So there'd be plenty of ways for you to watch it. And on this Wednesday edition, if you don't know if this is your first time listening, on Wednesdays, Erik and I will be going over some injuries and some other news to note from Oregon's press conferences this week. And lastly, just kind of doing our own little film tape review without actual film or tape, just kind of our thoughts going off the top of our heads going into this weekend's matchup. So let's begin with some of the injury things. No Tez Johnson, probably no Marcus Harper this week. I should note before we go into it all that practice was closed this week to the media. So we did not get to see any of it. Not that we see a lot of it, but we didn't get to see any of it this week. Didn't get to take attendance or anything like that and see who was at practice. So I'm confident that Marcus Harper and Tez Johnson are not going to be playing this week. I think
Same
that
here.
was kind of what we anticipated going into it. Oregon has a bye week next week, so if there's a chance that either of them play, it'll likely be after the bye. Even then, that's still kind of a question mark. Maybe more in line for Marcus Harper than Tez Johnson. But two other main injury notes: Jordan James and Jordan Birch. James did not. I think he had one carry in the second half against Maryland last week. Jordan Birch got dinged up towards the end of the Maryland game. I think Dan post game said it was an ankle issue. This week, Dan during his Monday and Wednesday press conference hasn't necessarily been committal in towards like if they're going to be playing, if they're going to be a big part of the game. He said like we'll continue to evaluate and see. He anticipates they'll be playing, but that could mean 15 snaps. That could mean
Sure.
45 snaps. So there's not a clear path, or maybe not a clear path, not a clear decision from Dan that we've heard this week as to if they're going to be full participants or it's going to be like how Jordan Birch was against Michigan, where it's like kind of like that 20, 35 snap count. And for James, I don't know,
There's
this seems to have been
there's
like
like
a
no
thing
clarity.
he's been dealing with.
Yeah, there's like
Yeah.
really no clarity with Jordan James. Jordan Birch, we watched leave the field with an ankle injury, which is what Dana said, as you noted there,
Right.
Jared. Jordan James just took a snap in the second half and didn't play the rest of the game. Was on the sideline with his helmet on. Like, I don't know. I don't have. I rewatched the game and there wasn't like a play where it looked like he got badly injured. He was yanked back at the very end of the first half on a run. It wasn't a penalty, but it looked kind of awkward. But he got up fine and ran off the field like he was okay. So not a lot of clarity on specifically what's going on there, but I guess that's one of those. We'll just have to wait and see what the availability report looks like on Saturday. And to your point on Dan, it feels to me, and maybe I'm misreading, but we're gonna go give my best try. I think the way he's worded these are more optimistic than some weeks with some of these injuries. I anticipate we'll see them. That feels like from reading just into the landing, kind of the way he talks about certain things, that feels like more of an optimistic way of framing it than some other games. So, but we'll have to wait and see what happens on Saturday, because we don't have a whole lot more to offer. That's kind of where they are with those two. Again, I don't think we see Tez. I don't think we see Harper. The Jordans, you could tell me they're going to play every snap of this game. You could tell me they're going to play not at all. And I would be like, okay, we'll meet somewhere in the middle probably.
Yeah, and the other thing with Jordan James is he's had these games where he just hasn't played in the second half, or has played sparingly in the second half, and he's seemingly been, right as rain the next game, and there hasn't really been an injury concern. I think it's interesting that of all the times that's happened, I think that's probably happened 2 or 3 times this year where Jordan James has just not really played in the second half, like has played 5, 6, 7, 8 snaps in the second half. This is the one week where instead of just being like, oh no, he's load management type of stuff, just trying to get him off of his feet, Dan has actually been like, oh, we're evaluating, like we're gonna be in the best interest of our players and make sure that they're healthy. So I thought that's been interesting, but we will find out on Saturday. And again, like I said earlier, we did not have practice access this week, so other injury concerns like Kerry Bryant Jr., other people that we've been keeping track of, we got nothing. We're flying blind, as some would say, going into this Wisconsin week. So I don't really have anything else for the injury part.
No, that's the only other thing from interviews this week that stood out to me was just something that Dan talked about today, and that was how they were working to limit penalties. This is obviously a big talking point this last week, and he says the defensive backs are out there in boxing gloves, which is interesting. We see the returners all the time, or somewhat regularly, in boxing gloves, just to make it more challenging to catch the ball, work on that. Haven't seen them in practice recently, at least. I think they did this a little bit in past springs, but having the defensive backs in boxing gloves so they're not grabbing. I think, one of the things when you go look at the penalties, which again, I thought were pretty much fine with the exception of the second Taishin penalty, in terms of they were the right calls. I think Oregon was very handsy, very grabby in this game, and they got bit. And clearly the message this week seems to be, don't be so handsy, don't be so grabby. We're going to make it impossible for you to grab them because you're going to be in boxing gloves. So we'll see what the outcome of that is, if that changes how they look in coverage, if they're, avoid those penalties. But I just thought that was kind of an interesting approach this week, and one that Dan seemed to indicate that kind of worked out pretty well. He said last Wednesday they had, I think, 13 penalties, and today they had 5, I believe, Jared. So, and we don't know the specifics of those penalties. And frankly, I was surprised he told us how many penalties or anything about practice at all. But that at least sort of seems to illustrate there's been some improvement there in some capacity, and now we just see what happens on Saturday.
I have a question for you.
Hit me.
Do you think that having defensive backs wearing boxing gloves will be effective? Because I don't know. I have my theories, but I'll let you answer.
I think the idea of when you watch this group and they do grab a lot, finding a way to make it impossible to do that in practice probably isn't a bad thing. Overall effectiveness, I don't know how much harping on that for 3 days will matter, considering this is I actually like when you're a little bit there's a fine line to walk, and that's why there's not a penalty every single play. I think you probably do need to use your hands a little bit to redirect players. It's just some of the instances over the weekend were pretty glaring and drew penalty flags. So I guess I think it's going to be helpful, but I don't know if it's going to change everything. And I also don't know, if you really want them to just not grab or not touch players at all with their hands. I think it's probably kind of not a bad thing in coverage sometimes to be a little bit aggressive, especially at the top of the route. So,
yeah, not that I'm going to critique Dan Lanning, Tosh Lupoy, and Coach Hampton's methodology and what they teach out there in the practice field. I am no football coach. I have no football experience. I like watching the sport. I understand it to some degree. So I'm not going to critique them, but don't you think like once those boxing gloves comes off, they're gonna be like, it's like after you break your arm and like suddenly you can do things with your arm. You're like, oh my god, I can move it again, and then maybe you do something you shouldn't because you have this free reign now that you're not in a cast. So I don't know. That's some
Okay.
of the things that I think of that probably won't have any consequence during an actual game, but it's what goes on up here. Everybody, I just put in my
You got some
uh,
skepticism. You're a little
yeah,
skeptical.
my put on the thinking cap. What you would do in middle school. Put on that thinking cap. That's what I'm using right now. So,
All right.
but I mean, they need to clean up on it. That's for sure. At least after last week. I mean, overall in the season they've been great. There's bound to be pass interference and holding calls in basically every single football game that's played in the 21st century. But they were just more than average last week against Maryland. I thought Maryland did a good job putting them into some precarious situations. Um, so we'll see if Wisconsin does that. The problem with Wisconsin, which we'll get to much later, is that the quarterback receiving duo that they have there is different than what it was against Maryland. So
Yeah.
we'll see. I have confidence that the secondary will kind of step up and do what they've done previously going into this week. Anything else from interviews that we would like to discuss?
Nothing like major for this matchup. I mean, Derek Harbin said he thought Mateo Uiagalelei could be a number 1 overall draft pick today, and that was like kind of interesting. Just a ceiling for what they think he can be. I mean, I'd be really curious to see what next year looks like. In fact, this is something that we'll, I'm sure, be talking about all next offseason because he's going to finish with double-digit sacks this year pretty clearly. And if he's a guy who goes out there and has like 16 sacks as a junior next year, and maybe there's not the clarity at the top of the draft with the quarterback position, and I'd have to really think ahead and think of who's going to be in that draft class. Maybe Derek's onto something there. But I just that stood out to me because when players on the same team, it's not unusual for them to support other players. To say something like that sort of speaks to just they think this guy's really, really special. And first overall pick or not, I do think this is a guy that is going to put himself in kind of the conversation amongst the better pass rushers Oregon's had here. Again, whether or not that's the first overall pick, I think there's a pretty good chance we look up in a couple of years here, whenever his career is done, and we say, gosh, he is a Mount Rushmore pass rusher. And maybe if he has his productive year this year and duplicates that or improves upon it next year, maybe he's somebody who's atop the all-time sacks list, because I don't think that list is, should have pulled this up before I went on this little diatribe, but I think the career list is like 27 or 28. Think. Yeah, let me pull this up really quick. So
yeah, the number 1 overall pick, I mean, it's tough. It's a really high bar. You got to be Trayvon Walker or Aiden Hutchinson, that type of caliber of a player. Not to say that Mateo Uiagalelei couldn't develop into that, because he still has plenty of years to grow here at Oregon. But he's certainly been a delight this year for Oregon's defense, especially considering when Birch was out, he stepped up his game and did really well. And when you have the tandem of those two guys together on a defensive line, there aren't a lot of offensive lines that can stop those guys. So that's something that's certainly a positive for Oregon moving forward. And if Birch is healthy this week, or Washington and going into the playoffs, that's again extremely, extremely helpful, because there are plenty of teams right now whose offensive lines aren't going to be able to compete. And I think this will be a good test this week against Wisconsin.
Yeah. The career list is 29 and a half sacks, which is Nick Reed owns. Mateo's at 9.5 right now, so he needs 20 over the rest of this season and next season. It's going to take a lot, but if they play far enough into this postseason, he could finish with 14, 15, and then he goes and does 14, 15 again next year. It could be there. We'll see.
And we are assuming that he'll leave after 3 years, which I would, but he would still, theoretically have another year or two. Well, year. I should say, to get that number if he decides to come back for all 4 seasons at Oregon. But I wouldn't. I'm a first-round draft prospect. I'm going right away, man. Couldn't tell me to do anything else.
I think that's what we'll see happen.
Yeah. We are going to take a quick little break, and then when we come back, we will be discussing just kind of our thoughts and analysis going into this upcoming matchup for Oregon against Wisconsin. All right, we're back. Welcome in. We're going to start by talking about Oregon's offense going against Wisconsin's defense this week. Unfortunately, we only had one offensive player to talk to this week
I
about this
know.
matchup, and it was our dear friend Dave Iuli, who wonderful interview, great kid. It's just there are other things that need to be talked about that may not involve Mr. Iuli and what he does well. So we didn't get to talk to DG or any of the wide receivers, and that's kind of where we should start, I think, just kind of in the secondary and how good Wisconsin has been this year against the pass.
Yeah. Well, before we get to that, just one thing that's really
Oh,
interesting. Sorry, just big picture
oh.
before we get
Mhm.
specifically to the secondary. I know, Jared, I told you to rein me in if I go all over the place, but I thought this was an important thing to note is
Sure.
when Wisconsin is winning games, and especially in Big Ten play, their defense has been unbelievable. 6 points to Purdue, 7 points to Rutgers, 3 points to Northwestern. You heard me read the names there. You get a sense of maybe why they were so dominant. But those are, I mean, anytime you're holding teams in single digits 3 consecutive weeks, that speaks to a defense that has some upside. The problem has been is when they've lost, they've given up 42 to Alabama, 38 to Southern California, 28 to Penn State, and then most recently 42 to Iowa before the bye. And so I bring that up to say it's kind of a weird deal here where when they've played, I mean, maybe it's not that weird. When they play bad competition, they kick their ass. When they play good competition, they kind of get their butts kicked. And so that's just broadly something that's in my mind as we enter this week of Oregon is clearly the most talented team on their schedule. Does this game fall in line with what we've seen them do against the better teams, or are they able to put together an effort where they actually produce, defensively similar to how they did in the games that they won impressively kind of during that 3-game win streak?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're right, though, because Rutgers, Northwestern, and Purdue are three of the bottom six teams in the
They're
Big
bad. These
12.
are bad teams. Yeah.
Bad football teams. Joining them are, for context, Michigan State, USC, and Maryland. So there are, some similar opponents, obviously, for Oregon and for Wisconsin this year with Michigan State and Purdue. But those are bad teams. Now, when you play these bad teams, you have to beat them. And that's exactly what Wisconsin did. They beat the crap out of them. They held Northwestern to 209 total yards, Purdue to 216 total yards, and Rutgers got the most with 271 total yards.
Yeah.
So you're looking at just really good defensive performances. They got a turnover in every single one of those games, 2 against Purdue and then 1 in the others. That's what you should be doing to the bad teams. And passing yards, 117, 103, 82 to Purdue, Northwestern, and Rutgers. So not bad, I would say.
Yeah, and this Wisconsin secondary has some guys. Like we'll talk about what they've got at corner in a second here, and obviously there's some real NFL talent there with Ricardo Hallman, but I think this is as good of a safety tandem Oregon will play all season, with the exception of Ohio State, which has the best safety tandem probably in the country with what they've got there. So, but Hunter Wohler was second in the Big Ten in tackles last year for Wisconsin. Was an all Big Ten player. I think PFF loved this guy. His grades were like in the high 80s, low 90s last year. This year, Preston Zachman, who I don't think it was necessarily a surefire he'd be a starter. He's been probably just as impressive, if not more impressive than Wohler. And together they kind of form these two, I don't want to say they're hybrid linebackers, but these are bigger safeties. And, 6'1", 6'2", 210, 220. Like, these are big safeties out there that move really well and are kind of enforcers. And what I'd be really curious to see is, can Oregon's speed beat those guys over the top? Because, like I said, I think they're great in the box. I think these guys can certainly eliminate plays over the middle of the field. I do just wonder if Oregon can get the ball over the top, what their recovery speed looks like. And so if Oregon has the ability to take some shots, this feels like a week where this could be a secondary to achieve that. But in so many other areas of the field, those two guys are really impactful. And then, I think Matt had the stat yesterday. Let me see if I can pull it up here on PFF, but Hallman, I think, has been targeted 18 times all season, which is crazy. That's what they've got here for him on PFF. And that's just not a guy they throw at, or anyone's really chosen to throw at this year. and it'll be interesting to see what Oregon's operation looks like. And why I think it's important to start with the secondary is not only is this the strength of Wisconsin's defense, it's a defense that ranks kind of in the middle in total defense in the Big Ten, but is right near the top in pass defense, I think third. I guess I'll just be curious to see how Oregon really wants to go at these guys and really attack them. And it's an Oregon pass offense that last week kind of looked off its mark a little bit. Some drop issues early. I don't think it was Dylan's sharpest game. Obviously, you're playing without Tez. That changes a lot. That's going to be, to me, one of the areas that's important for this game is Oregon's pass offense, which has been so dynamic all season, was averaging almost 300 yards per game going into the Maryland game. Do we see that kind of an effort here where they're able to get deep on these guys and they're able to have some success? Because the better teams that Wisconsin has played have been able to have some success against them. I think there's a couple teams over 200 yards, a couple teams over 3. So this is a pass defense that could be beaten by the elite pass offenses. I'm just curious to see what this Oregon pass offense looks like against this Wisconsin defense, because I think if they're able to have success there, this could be a game where you kind of see the doors blown off a little bit, because so far this season, Wisconsin's not been very good against the run at all.
No, they have not been good against the run, but yeah, against the pass, they've been awesome. The highest amount they've allowed this year was the USC earlier in the season with 308. They've held, 7 opponents to under 200 yards passing. That's pretty good. But granted, really these opponents are Western Michigan, South Dakota, Purdue, Rutgers, Northwestern, like we talked about, and then Iowa, noted passing attack Iowa.
Iowa, which ran for 320 yards in that game.
Yeah, 329. Like they attempted 10 passes, completed 7 of them, though, going 1 for a touchdown, too. So, again, not the best passing offenses to go against, except for USC, where as bad as USC has been this year, like Miller Moss and that receiving core is still pretty darn good. And then the way that they scheme up games is heavily pass influenced. So, that's a decent team that you can look at. I think allowing Drew Aller to throw for 246 yards and 2 touchdowns and 80% completions is a question mark for me, because I don't think Drew Aller is that good, and maybe I'll be eating my words one day talking about that. But as of right now,
we just saw what he did against Ohio State, and it wasn't pretty, right?
Was not pretty, yeah. The thing I will be looking for in the passing attack, and you talked about, Eric, of going deep. I'm kind of a segue from that, or not a segue, but an addition is just kind of the speed that Oregon has. That's been a constant theme this year when Oregon has gone against some of these Big Ten teams, and not like Ohio State, but a majority of everybody else. And I thought actually Maryland did a good job here, but Oregon's speed advantage has been a significant advantage, whether that's on the perimeter, in the middle of the field, the running backs, the offensive linemen just pulling and getting out and getting a secondary guy. It's been a big advantage for Oregon. And Wisconsin for years and years and years has been this big, burly, heavy-hitting, technically sound defense that hasn't necessarily had a lot of athletes. You go back into the Rose Bowls that Oregon has played against Wisconsin, which are the last 2 times they've played, speed advantage has been one there too. And we're talking about, obviously 2020 is more recent, but the ones before that as well, that's been a huge speed advantage, and this is kind of how Wisconsin has played. Now, I think Luke Fickell is a good coach and can recruit and get some guys there who are speedy, who are what we consider modern-day athletes at some of these positions. And obviously Oregon loses Tez Johnson, who is one of their speediest guys in the team, if not the fastest in short yardages for the offense. But I think that's just going to be something to monitor. I don't know if they've gone against receivers like this. And if they have, it's been against Southern Cal.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that's where they threw for 308 yards, 3 touchdowns, and completed almost 70% of their passes. So I'll be interested to see what that looks like. Obviously, no Tez Johnson in this game, so it's going to be up to Evan Stewart and Trayshawn Holden, who, Stu is one of the fastest kids on the team. Trayshawn can get up to speed when he's going. I think Justice Lowe has some quickness, so I'll just be interested to see how the speed of that defense, the speed of Oregon's offense goes against the speed of Wisconsin's defense, because that's been something when you watch tape, you're like, this game appears a little slower. It's not as bad as when you watch Purdue and you're like, oof, these linebackers cannot move. But there are some shades of that. I think Wisconsin is a significantly better defense than Purdue, and that's not saying anything outlandish or anything like that. But I think the speed element could come into effect again this week.
Wisconsin's very sound, I would say, on defense.
Yeah.
And so how do you defeat that? By just being more athletic, right? I mean, that's what you see in their losses. It is teams having some success of just beating them in space. And Alabama, which again was a long time ago, a different quarterback for Wisconsin. A lot of things have changed since, but they just were kind of at a different level athletically. And I like to think, though, okay, Oregon's top in the, obviously Oregon's number one in the CFP. Alabama's a little further behind that, but I think Oregon and Alabama, of the teams Wisconsin have played, maybe are the most similar athlete to athlete. USC would probably be the other team you'd throw in there.
Yeah.
I just look at those matchups and go, like, based upon what we saw in those games, it feels like this should be very favorable for Oregon. And the only thing that kind of gets me a little bit concerned about their ability to take advantage of this is just it didn't look quite right last week against Maryland and without Tez, and just kind of got another week now to find some answers. I don't doubt Will Stein at all in terms of his ability to scheme and play to those advantages, but I think this is going to be a game where early maybe they want to hit a couple of these to prove, hey, we still got kind of that knockout punch. We saw it against Michigan, ironically, without Tez, right? They threw the ball down the field to Trayshawn with a lot of success. They tried to get it to Evan a little bit, not quite as much success, but I'm going to guess this is a game where they're going to want to try to do that early.
Well, I was just going to say, the other thing is they might not even have to. Like, this is not a great rush defense for Wisconsin.
Also true, yep.
Oregon's been up and down this season in the rushing offense, but the last couple of weeks, like Penn State ran for 173. Obviously, Iowa ran for 329 yards. I don't think Oregon will be doing that. But they've only held one team to under 100 yards rushing this year, and that was Purdue. And we know Purdue actually ran the ball. Purdue
actually ran Oregon. Pretty good against Oregon, yeah.
Yeah, they just didn't have, like, they couldn't do anything else, so they had to run the ball. But 181 to Bama, 161 to USC, 168 to Rutgers, 127 to Northwestern. Like, these are some decent rushing totals, and I have the stat here. They allow, 164.6 yards on average, which is second worst in the Big Ten. The only team worst is Purdue, which is allowing an unreasonable 199.9 yards per game, which is not great. But if you're Oregon, I think you have to try to establish the run at first, because if Wisconsin can show that they can stop the run, or at least prevent big plays from happening, if Jordan James can't go and Noah Whittington has the bulk of the carries, and although he's looked significantly better than he did earlier in the season, maybe he just doesn't have the wiggle that James does. Like, then you're gonna have to try to throw the ball. But if I'm Oregon, I'm gonna try to establish the run early, because if they can just get 6-7 yards a carry, like a lot of other teams have done this year, the game's over, I think.
And that's why I think Jordan's availability, and again, I'm pretty optimistic he'll play. What kind of workload he can handle is maybe another question. Mm-hmm. But maybe it's a situation where you go, hey, Jordan, give us similar to last week. Give us your best half. Give us what you can for a half. We'll work you as much as we feel comfortable with, and let's do what we've done to other teams in Big Ten play and kind of land that knockout blow where you're up 28-10 or you're up 21-0 at half. And then that kind of takes the pressure off, and you can turn over to Noah with a bit of a lead in the second half, right? Then that's something that's kind of in my head. But if Noah's like unavailable in this game, which is not what I'm expecting, that puts a lot of pressure on Noah Whittington's shoulders, but it also puts a lot of pressure, I think, on Dylan Gabriel to find things in the run game, which has been kind of hit and miss this year. When it's worked for big touchdowns. When it hasn't worked, right, he's taken some shots that you don't love to see from your quarterback. And then also put some pressure on, okay, we think it's Jalen Lamar is clearly their number 3. There hasn't been a game this year where he's really had to be very involved in the first half. If that's something that's asked of him, how does he respond? Do we see a DeJuan Riggs or a Jay Harris kind of get involved? Guys who haven't been really involved in games that are competitive. These are players who come in fourth quarters and looked, shown some flashes, but that'll be something to kind of see how it works out, and kind of can they consistently find that success on the ground if their alpha guy is not available for them. So that will be something to kind of monitor of, like, okay, if Jordan is actually out for this game, how do they recover? I'd still be rather optimistic given the talent and the depth, but a lot of the guys you'd be relying on haven't been asked to kind of carry a heavy workload in previous games, at least.
All right, let's flip over to the other side of the ball. Oregon's defense versus Wisconsin's offense. First up, Wisconsin's quarterback Braden Locke is a quarterback. He is
He was a
up and
backup
down.
he was a backup quarterback to start the season for a reason.
Sure was. Yeah. Tyler Van Dyke was the starting quarterback, got hurt against Alabama, out for the season. So Locke has been in ever since and has some okay games and some not so okay games. He's got 8 touchdowns this season, 8 interceptions, I believe it is. On PFF, he has 6 big time throws, which is like, um, down the field, like just fitting into a tight window. Um, so he has that, but he also has 15 turnover worthy throws. So again, not the best ratio you want to see from your quarterback. Pretty high completion percentage, but does a lot of his stuff in the short yardages.
Mhm.
I think it's 40% of his attempts are short passes between 0 and 9 yards, according to PFF, which is fine when that's all you really need to do to try to move the ball down the field. Um, Oregon's really good against short distance passers. They've done really well against quarterbacks who kind of align to what Locke has done this season. You kind of look at the last or some of the last opponents. You look at Michigan and they have Colston Loveland, but there's no first round tight end on this Wisconsin team. You look at Purdue, Oregon completely shut down the passing game that week. Like they, despite Maryland throwing for 44 times, they only had 206, 208 passing yards, whatever it was, a season low for Maryland. That is a huge strength of Oregon's defense. We talked about that for numerous weeks now. So if you can block out whatever Locke can do through the air, which might be a lot because they have a week off and maybe they see something in Oregon's defense, but we'll see what that when the time comes. Then you just have to focus on the rushing attack for Wisconsin, which has been pretty good this year. It hasn't been what Wisconsin rushing attacks have been in years past, and that's one of the best in the country, but it's been pretty good this year.
Back to the short passing game for a second, because I think that's
Mm-hmm.
an important thing here. Because you're right, you look at the splits. Like I think I looked at it a couple of days ago. I think Locke has 7 completions on 24 pass attempts down the field, basically, which is not very good. It's also the part of the field he's thrown his most interceptions.
Yeah.
And I bring that up because, you look at Oregon's offense, and it is an offense that very similar to, like, I bet the splits are pretty similar between Oregon and Wisconsin in terms of depth of target, in terms of like a lot of what they're doing is in the screen game, stuff that's, passes that are before the chains where the player makes the run, runs it and gets the first down. The difference to me there is, while I think Wisconsin does have some guys that are pretty explosive in the pass game, to your point earlier, Jared, the secondary has been awesome at tackling in space. Like that's been one of the most impressive things. They've been great in coverage, although recently they're a little bit too handsy and got some flags, but they rarely give up much after the catch. And I just don't see there being as much of an advantage for Wisconsin there. That doesn't mean they can't break a couple or have some success, but I also kind of go like, if the meat of their pass attack is going to be stuff underneath, that's an area of the field where Oregon is really good defensively. And I just have a hard time seeing that be a strength there. So if you take that part of the way, they don't really have a vertical pass attack. Kind of brings us back to your point earlier of like, if you make them one-dimensional and it's the run game, as much as I love this Wisconsin offensive line, which we haven't spoken of, and it's probably the strength of the entire team, or at least certainly the offense, is their offensive line. They've got 2 NFL tackles with Jack Nelson and Riley Malman. They've got some guys in the interior who probably also have a chance to be Sunday players. The tackles are the clear stars, kind of similar to Oregon, where you've got the 2 big-time offensive tackles that are going to be decently drafted players going forward. But if they if the pressure comes to like, hey, you got to run the ball, this is also not an Oregon defense where that's easy to achieve. Like, for as good as those 2 guys are, we just spent a little time talking about how Mateo might be a first-round draft pick. I think Jordan Birch has a chance to be a first-round draft pick. I think Derek Harmon has a chance to be a first-round draft pick. So you're talking about some really talented players for Wisconsin going against some extremely talented players for Oregon. And I just go, it's hard for me to see that being a huge advantage for Wisconsin. And that's why it's hard for me kind of looking at this game broadly to go, where does 24 to 31 points come from for Wisconsin? Because that's probably the total you're going to have to hit to beat Oregon, and probably more than 24, probably has to be more than 30. And I just have a really hard time seeing this offense with some of their deficiencies and the way Oregon defends the things they do well. I just have a hard time seeing those balancing out where you see Wisconsin have this big day. But we'll see.
Right.
I've been wrong on this kind of analysis before, but I think you just look at this. It's a lot of it is either strength on strength or kind of weakness on strength, and in most cases, it comes up pretty favorable for Oregon.
Yeah, Wisconsin did a lot of their heavy lifting in like the rushing game in their 3-game winning streak against Purdue, Rutgers, and Northwestern. They ran for 228, 309, and 199 against those guys. They have 1,563 yards on the season. And if I can do quick math, like that's almost 700 yards of those in that 3-game sample size. Now they've only played 9 games. So in the last 6, it's like 6 games for 800-ish yards. Like that's not great. Against Penn State, it was 81 yards on 27 carries. Against Iowa, which is a better defensive run team, it was 124 yards on 28 carries. So kind of good, 4.4 yards per carry. Like you would take that all day. But then it comes to the point where it's like if you get into 3rd and long situations, which is what we've talked about a lot on this podcast over the course of the year, there's not like the Locke as a quarterback isn't necessarily equipped to deal with that. I don't think he has the weapons to do it. I think he could have the protection from the offensive line to have enough time to look in the pocket and find guys, but it's just at that point it's like, okay, can your guys get open in zone? Can your guys get open against man coverage? And this is a strength of Oregon's defense, is playing zone and man coverage with Nico Reed and Jabbar Muhammad and all the secondary players. So if you're Oregon, I think it's the same game plan as it has been for a while now. Force teams into 3rd and long and let your pass rush go to work and let your defensive backs do what they do. And if that can happen, like you said, Wisconsin's going to need to score points. They're not the best at scoring points. They're 25.1 points per game. I think that's 93rd in the country. Scroll up, 92nd in the country out of 134 teams. So scoring points is not necessarily their forte.
And again, how many of those points came in that 3-game run, right? 52 against Purdue, 42 against Rutgers, only 23 against Northwestern. But,
right.
You what is that? About 120 of the points that they've had this season have come in a 3-game run against competition that we admit's not very good. And I mean, this is a team that hasn't scored more than 21 points against a team with the winning record this year, right? And they scored 10 against Bama, 21 against Southern California. Actually, Southern California does not have a winning record, so recant that stat I just gave. And then 13 against Penn State and 10 against Iowa. So
right.
That's why in my head here, it feels like if Oregon comes and plays at the level that they are, they might just be able to overwhelm this Wisconsin team, because that's kind of been Wisconsin's track record. And the things that are going for Wisconsin would be, hey, it's a home game. It's coming off a bye week that gives us a little extra advantage. And Oregon is coming across the country, and this is their 8th straight game, which is a storyline none of the Oregon players have given any credence, which doesn't really surprise me. But it is, as James Krepke had the stat and has asked it to everybody this week, basically. But Oregon's played 8 straight weeks without a break. Nobody else in the country is doing that. Everybody else has had a break in there somewhere. And does that wear out? Is this team worn out and doesn't show up with its best effort? And I really think that's Wisconsin's path to this game being competitive or pulling off an upset, is Oregon comes out and just turns in another, a performance similar to Maryland, maybe worse, on the road in a hostile environment, and that crowd starts getting involved and it kind of gets turned sideways. Like that's the path to Wisconsin winning or having success, because I really do think if Oregon comes out and plays, executes well and looks clean, it looks like it's how it's looked, frankly, the other 2 times they've gone on the road in Big Ten play early, at least. Like, this is not a game I expect Wisconsin has the firepower offensively to keep up with. And unless these corners and the defensive backs really do an A+ job shutting down Oregon's pass attack, I don't think the defense is necessarily up to par to keep Oregon from scoring, around its average, which will be somewhere in the 30s.
Yeah, I agree. And then the key to Oregon here is what they did against Michigan. Come out hot early. Don't have the muff punt. Go up 14-17-0, quiet the crowd, and then suddenly the home field advantage kind of dissipates. Take care of the ball. Don't turn the ball over. That's how the home crowd gets back into it. And maybe score some points in the 3rd quarter. We'll see. But
yeah, that would help. That couldn't hurt.
Just a little bit. Yeah. I mean, I think that's it for me. I don't know if you have anything else.
Just to tack on the penalty thing, you hope you see improvement there, because that's another area where if you're extending Wisconsin drives, and again we've already talked about it, I don't think this Wisconsin offense is really built to have a lot of sustained success against Oregon. But if you're holding and you're getting called for penalties that extend drives, much like it was against Maryland,
that's the 15 up.
Yeah, that's the way it goes, right? I mean, the first Maryland touchdown drive was aided by 3 penalties that gave them first downs and a lot of yardage. So that's the other kind of thing. When I talked about Oregon playing kind of a clunker of a game, that's the other thing you hope to see improvement. And we'll see if those boxing gloves worked out for them, Jared.
Yeah, we sure will. That'll do it for us here on the Autzen Audibles podcast. Thank you for listening. If you can, leave a comment, leave a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcasts. That'll greatly help us going forward. Oregon and Wisconsin meet this weekend on Saturday, November 16th, starting at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 Eastern on NBC, or streaming live on Peacock. It'll be a fun one up there in Camp Randall.
Yeah.
Eric, safe travels to you. I'll see you again on Monday, I assume.
Yeah. No Monday day landing press conference. It's a bye. It's a bye week.
That's right. All right, then I'll never see you again.
Yeah, well,
this is it.
This is our last meeting.
Yeah, this is it. But thank you all for listening to the Autzen Audibles podcast. We will catch you on the next one.
Talk to you later, folks.